Good morning and welcome. I'm very happy to be able to introduce Professor Alfred. I met through some interesting circumstances. It was
Do you want to tell the story?
Man, as I was waiting for the train, I noticed this man behind me with his phone trying to stealthily take pictures of me, and eventually he came up and asked me, "Well, are you a real Franciscan?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am actually." And so we ended up talking the entire way back to UIC, and he invited me to speak to your class last semester to show, look, this is actually part of a living tradition. This isn't just archaic study, but this is actually, in a sense, somebody's life, even in the modern day. So I'm very happy to present to you Alfred Thomas. Alfred was born in Lancashire, England, and was educated at Trinity Hall, Cambridge University, where he received his Bachelor of Arts and PhD. He was John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University from 1995 to 2002, and is currently Professor of English here at UIC. He has published 10 books, including A Blessed Shore, England and Bohemia from Chaucer to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare, Dissent and the Cold War. His forthcoming book, on which his talk today is based, is Shakespeare, Catholicism and the Middle Ages. And if at the end of this talk you have more interest, because this is only a very brief talk on a rather expansive topic, there are flyers in the back for more information about his book. And without further ado, Professor Alfred.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, he must have been freaking out when he saw me secretly photographing him. And then I had to explain my motivation, because I'm very interested in the Dominican and Franciscan friars, and so I had a kind of professional investment in seeing a real friar. You don't see many. Certainly not in my native England where I grew up. You don't see many friars these days. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased and honored to be here, and thank you to the Center, the Catholic Chaplaincy, for hosting this event. Thank you for Brother Nathan for inviting me, and I'd like to also thank my colleague Natasha Barnes, who helped promote this event and advertise it. She's a really wonderful DUS. She's doing a great job of advertising our undergraduate program, so I'd like to dedicate this presentation to her. Yeah. Okay. In the Christmas holidays of 1609, an unlicensed play was staged at Galthwaite Hall, the home of Sir John Yorke, in the North Yorkshire village of Nidderdale. The players were named the Simpson Brothers, and they were Catholics at a time when Catholic faith was oppressed in England, and Catholic priests were executed as traitors to the crown. In fact, as many as 200 priests were executed as traitors during the reign of Elizabeth I. And although this number decreased in the reign of her successor, James I, it carried on to a degree. The play performed by the Simpson Brothers included a subversive interlude in which the devil carries off a Church of England minister to hell. In spite of the careful monitoring of those allowed in, a local Protestant preacher managed to get in and denounce the performance to the authorities as seditious. The case was brought before the Star Chamber in London, and 2 years later Sir John and his wife were fined more than £4,000 for allowing the performance to take place. That's a lot of money now. Imagine what it was like then. Unable to pay the staggering sum, the couple was imprisoned in the Fleet prison in London and released only in 1617. Can you hear me okay? Is the volume okay? The Star Chamber proceedings against Sir John revealed that the Simpson Brothers' repertoire list of productions included 2 of Shakespeare's plays, Pericles and King Lear. Now, there's no hard and fast evidence that the plays were really performed by the brothers, but if they were, which is perfectly possible, they would constitute the earliest appropriation of Shakespeare's drama, and the play was alive at the time. He only died in 1616. Shakespeare's King Lear is based upon an older play, as well as a brief account in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain, 1136. In Geoffrey's version, Old Lear is disowned by 2 of his daughters, Regan and Goneril, crosses the sea where he is reconciled with his youngest exiled daughter called Cordell in the original, or Cordelia, who is the wife of the King of Gaul. I take it you're all familiar with the plot line of King Lear, so I don't have to give that background. Accompanied by Cordelia, Lear returns to Britain and defeats his son-in-law, thus bringing the land under his rule once again. Old Lear dies 3 years later, and Cordelia inherits the government before being overthrown 5 years later by her nephews. That's very different from the ending of Shakespeare's play, which, as you will recall, is much bleaker, either than Geoffrey's account or the older lost play. Since both Lear and Cordelia die in the most violent and tragic circumstances, Cordelia is hanged, and Lear dies essentially of a broken heart a little while later. The aim of this talk is not to argue that Shakespeare was a Catholic, although he may have been, but to explore how Catholics may have responded to his greatest tragedy and some of his other plays. In recent scholarship, confessional scholars have been keen to present Shakespeare as a Catholic dissident, and often tried to make the evidence fit the thesis rather than the other way round. The trouble is that we don't have enough biographical evidence one way or the other to prove the case. Shakespeare comes from Warwickshire, a traditional stronghold of the old faith, and may even have spent the lost years before he surfaces in London in 1592 as a tutor in a Catholic household in Lancashire. That's not been proved, but it's a very strong hypothesis. His mother, Mary Arden, came from an old Catholic family and even numbered certain Catholic priests among her relatives. Shakespeare was tutored at Stratford Grammar School by 2 Catholic graduates of Oxford University. All this is documented. And intriguingly, in the 18th century, a document was found hidden in the rafters of the family home in Stratford that appears to have been a confession of faith signed by Shakespeare's father. The original was drafted by Carlo Borromeo, the Archbishop of Milan, and it was circulated by the missionary priests coming into England, and the idea is, the thesis is that this was signed by Shakespeare's father. Unfortunately, the document was lost, but a transcription has survived, which strengthens the argument that this was an actual document. Now, all this is circumstantial evidence. It doesn't prove that Shakespeare was a Catholic himself, but neither does it disprove it, right? So, unfortunately, there are no letters by Shakespeare or to Shakespeare to shed light on his personal beliefs. This may be happenstance, or it may have been intentional on his part. If the mixed messages of his plays are anything to go by, Shakespeare was a very cautious man. And he had good reason to be. His friend, Ben Jonson, an avowed Catholic, had been thrown into jail on more than one occasion, and his older contemporary, Christopher Marlowe, a self-confessed atheist, was killed in very suspicious circumstances in 1593, possibly the victim of a government assassination. So to be a playwright in Shakespeare's England was, rather as in Eastern Europe during the communist period, a dangerous thing, or potentially dangerous thing. What we do have is Shakespeare's work, his 30-odd plays and poems. And in this talk, I'll be focusing on the evidence provided by these writings, 2 plays in particular and a sonnet, to suggest that even if Shakespeare was not a Catholic himself, he was almost certainly sympathetic to the plights of persecuted Catholics, amongst others his family members. I will argue that there are many moments in the plays which evince compassion for the persecuted Catholics of England. More importantly, I shall be asking how would the Catholic audience of King Lear, those people in Nidderdale in the north, have reacted to these moments in the play? How would they have related to a daughter, Cordelia, who refuses to sanction her father's folly and speaks truth to power? And how would they have reacted to the play's bleak ending, when Lear and his daughter both die? Now, although Shakespeare's ending of King Lear would have moved everyone who saw it, regardless of whether they were Catholic or Protestant, Catholics may have drawn rather different conclusions from it, based on their beliefs. For one thing, the cruelty exhibited in the play, it's one of the most cruelest plays by Shakespeare, and especially Cordelia's arbitrary hanging at the end of it, might not have been quite as surprising to the Catholics of Yorkshire as to their Protestant counterparts in London. The Northern Rebellion of 1569, a grassroots revolt against the imposition of the Protestant prayer book under Elizabeth, led by the Catholic Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, with a view to restoring the faith in England, marked a major watershed in English history. In contrast to previous uprisings, when only the ringleaders were executed, after the collapse of the Northern Rebellion, 600 Catholic rebels were hanged throughout the region. So imagine a landscape full of gibbets. That is to say, 1/10 of the number of rebels, a literal decimation of the total number of 6,000. I'm using decimation in the correct way, not the way President Trump recently used it, but rather in the literal, sorry to be so, an English professor here, but meaning 1/10 of the number, 1/10. And this was a deliberate government policy of deterrence, or terror as the word used by the Queen's chief minister, in coordinating the reprisal. So the violent crushing of the rebellion by government troops would have haunted the survivors, and the account of it passed on to their children. the sheer arbitrariness of Cordelia's death, the fact that she's hanged and her father, who is also slated for execution, is not, recalls what one historian of the uprising has termed, quote, the appearance of a lottery in the selection of those who were hanged, a kind of rough, arbitrary justice. So to the Catholics of Yorkshire, the violence and disorder of Lear's kingdom may have been felt all too familiar. Less a warning of what might happen in the future, and more a description of what already happened. A world turned upside down in which the adherents of the old faith were punished and those of the new Protestant faith triumphant. But if the tragic circumstances of Shakespeare's play were familiar to the people of Nidderdale, they also perhaps instilled a spirit of defiance. By focusing on the Catholic and medieval motifs in the play, we might be able to reconstruct how this local audience, disaffected and distant from London, would have responded to it. So this section is called Cordelia and the Virgin Martyrs. In deciding to set King Lear in pagan Britain, Shakespeare may have wished to camouflage his desire to comment on the religious politics of the time. We know that the original play script was censored. There are two versions of King Lear. One was censored, presumably because certain elements offended the government. In particular, Lear's obsession with hunting reflects negatively on the King James's negligent laissez-faire attitude to government. He was hunting a lot and leaving the stuff to his business to his ministers. In setting the play in the distant past and making his protagonist old rather than young, James I was 36 when he ascended the English throne. Shakespeare was able to disguise his criticism of royal monopolies, favouritism and neglect of government. No doubt these reservations would have been shared by the Catholic subjects of James, but more serious in their eyes were James's broken promises of religious toleration. For after the death of Elizabeth I and the end of the Tudor dynasty in 1603, the succession of the new Stuart King James VI of Scotland as James I of England revived hopes among the beleaguered Catholic minority that a new era of tolerance would finally be ushered in. Sonnet 107, which is on the first quotation on your handout, has long been seen as an allusion, if you don't have a handout by the way, they're on the back there, has long been seen as an allusion to the death of Elizabeth I and the hoped for inauguration of a new time of peace and concord under James. The young man addressed in the poem could well be Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, the man who's often considered the fair youth of the sonnets. And he was a Catholic himself, he was Shakespeare's patron, and he was imprisoned at this time for rebelling against Elizabeth and was then released by James. So there's a sort of upbeat feeling to the whole sonnet, which I'll just read to you now. Not mine own fears, nor the prophetic soul of the wide world, dreaming on things to come, can yet the lease of my true love control, supposed as forfeit to a confined doom. The mortal moon hath her eclipse endured, that's Elizabeth, and the sad augurs mock their own presage. Incertainties now crown themselves assured, and peace proclaims olives of endless age. Now with the drops of this most balmy time, my love looks fresh, and death to me subscribes, since spite of him I'll live in this poor rhyme, while he insults o'er dull and speechless tribes. And thou in this shalt find thy monument, when tyrants' crests and tombs of brass are spent. And notice the use of the word tyrant there. That word will crop up a lot in my quotations. Tyrants, probably a reference to Elizabeth. Writing many years later about the death of Elizabeth and the accession of James, the underground Jesuit priest Oswald Tesman, you have to remember that priests were actually hiding. They weren't floating around in public, they were encrypted. Speaks in similar language of the euphoric mood of Catholics at this time. Quote, they, the Catholics, hoped that after the long and damaging flood of unrelenting persecution, some bird of good omen would bring them olives of branches of peace, with word of land where they could set their feet and enjoy for the future that peace so long desired. Same image in Shakespeare, olive branch. None of this, of course, proves that Shakespeare was a Catholic, but it does suggest that, at the very least, he shared the hopes of these people, these Catholics, for a new era of religious peace and harmony. Unfortunately, this did not happen. The new king reneged on his verbal promises of toleration, and it soon became apparent that James had no intention of repealing the oppressive anti-Catholic penal laws that had marked and marred the reign of his predecessor. James's broken promise must have been a bitter blow to his Catholic subjects. Hoping for some kind of toleration along the lines shown to the French Protestants by the recent Edict of Nantes, so even France was, granting toleration by the end of the 1590s, many English Catholics now began to despair. The inevitable consequence was the outbreak of plots against the king. Insurgencies always have a reason. If you have an insurgency, it's because there will be something behind it. So this signalled the byplot of 1603. The plotters claimed that they turned on James because he'd reneged on his pre-succession promises of toleration. And following the collapse of the plot, James began to reinstate anti-Catholic laws introduced by his predecessor Elizabeth. But yet worse was yet to come. In November 1605, a group of desperate Catholic gentlemen attempted to assassinate the king, his whole family, and the country's political elite by blowing them up in the Parliament House during the opening of the new session. As if it had not been foiled in the last moment, the plot would have succeeded in destroying the Parliament House itself and damaging all the buildings within 500 yards of it. Forensic scientists have done experiments on this stuff, including Westminster Hall and Westminster Abbey. Hundreds of people would have died in the blast. This is terrorism avant la lettre. This stuff is the stuff of today, my friends, I think I put it to you. Following the failure of the gunpowder plot and the execution of the plotters, the English Parliament enacted a law on June the 25th, 1606, known as the Oath of Allegiance, that required the king's Catholic subjects to acknowledge him not only as their lawful sovereign, but also as their spiritual lord. James was essentially asserting his belief in the divine right of kings to counter papal power with the assertion of monarchical religious power. This crucially implied the right of the state not only to control the subjects' bodies, but also their consciences. Foucault sees this configuration as sort of internalized mechanism of surveillance happening in the Enlightened, but more recent historians have shown that this dynamic was already at work in the early modern period, in other words, the formations of the early modern state. This unprecedented legislation created a profound conflict of loyalty for English Catholics between their temporal allegiance to the king as the head of state and their spiritual allegiance to the Pope in Rome. Regardless of his own beliefs, Shakespeare must have been aware of this conflict of loyalty, because at the time his own daughter Susanna was among 21 parishioners, at least of whom a third were convicted Catholics, I should say convinced Catholics, who were cited on April the 6th, 1606, for refusing to appear at Stratford's Holy Trinity Church for mandatory communion in the Church of England. Everybody was required to go to Church of England services. If you didn't, you were known as a recusant, which comes from the Latin word recusare. So if you use the word recusant, that will usually refer to Catholics. It doesn't have to be Catholic. It could have been Protestants, but usually here it refers to Catholics. So the dilemma of Catholics caught between their temporal allegiance to the king and their spiritual loyalty to the Pope is played out, I think, in Cordelia's famous refusal at the beginning of the play to comply with her father's demand for absolute love, on the legal grounds that when she marries, she would be required to transfer half of her allegiance to her spouse. She's very legalistic about this, Cordelia. She's not being emotional, she's being very matter-of-fact. I'll just read that speech. "Good my lord, you have begot me, bred me, loved me. I return those duties back as are right fit. Obey you, love you, and most honour you. Why have my sisters husbands if they say they love you all? Happily when I shall wed, that lord whose hand must take my plight shall carry half my love with him, half my care and duty." And she was speaking to the law there. Wives were required to basically subjugate themselves to their husbands. And Cordelia's refusal to comply with her father's absolute demands, remember this is an absolute demand, reflects, I think, the defiance of many Catholic women during the reigns of Elizabeth and King James. Interestingly, husbands usually complied with the law, while their wives often refused. And this was probably because wives were less likely to be prosecuted by their husbands. It was an old law, under English common law, by which a woman, or femme couvert as she was called, did not have legal existence. So that got her off the hook, so to speak. So only the husbands were fined or imprisoned. So the women could kind of be more defiant for that reason. As one historian has pointed out, quote, "Gentry women remained a mainstay of English Catholicism, while their central role in bringing up children helped ensure that the faith would be passed on to the next generation." Unquote. Many of these women showed great courage and devotion. Women like Anne, wife of Thomas Percy, 7th Earl of Northumberland, who led the previously discussed Northern Uprising of 1569. Remember that uprising I mentioned at the beginning? Well, Percy was himself vacillating in his support for the rebellion, but his wife was very gung-ho. She bolstered his resolve with her strong will, even riding into battle with the rebels heavily pregnant. Strong women. These Catholic women, inspired by the heroic lives, were also inspired by the heroic lives of the Virgin Martyrs of the early church. Maybe this is a good moment to switch to the next image. The most famous account of the lives of the saints was, of course, the Golden Legend by the Dominican Jacobus de Voragine. This became one of the most popular books of the Middle Ages and was still being read by Catholics in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, even though they weren't supposed to be read. The most celebrated of the Virgin Martyrs were Margaret of Antioch, Catherine of Alexandria, Dorothea of Caesarea, Agnes of Rome, and Barbara. Their lives were disseminated in textual and visual form throughout the Middle Ages and survive today in English church wall paintings such as the spectacular mid-15th century scenes from the life and passion of St Catherine in Pickering Church in North Yorkshire. I've been lucky enough to go there. I've been there several times. It's absolutely amazing. All the walls are covered with wall paintings, so it's a mid-15th century restoration. They would have been whitewashed in the Reformation, but then they were restored. By the way, I'd just like to mention that the other glorious thing about Pickering, apart from its beautiful church, is it has one of the best pie shops I have ever been. If you like pork and meat pies, fantastic. You have to go to Pickering. These are the kind of images of traditional religion that would have been familiar to the older recusants of Nidderdale. Now, although many of the paintings were effaced or whitewashed during the Elizabethan period, memory of them, I think, would have lingered on in the minds of local people. In each of the Virgin Martyr legends, the core story is basically the same. A young woman, a pagan, converts to Christianity, rejects her pagan family and pledges herself to Christ, as Catherine does here. In some cases, as in the life of Margaret, Dorothea and Barbara, the saint's father is the one who threatens his daughter with pain and violence if she carries on with her beliefs. But usually her faith prevails. Invariably her faith prevails. And as in King Lear, it's the fathers of these defiant daughters who order the punishment. But the daughters are rewarded for their suffering by becoming brides of Christ in heaven. The Virgin Martyrs invariably appeared indifferent to the threats of torture and transcend pain through their love of their celestial spouse, Christ. Now, Cordelia's defiance of her father's demands exemplifies the fate of those early Virgin Martyrs of the Church and would have been seen as such by the local Catholic audience in Nidderdale. Lear, we must remember, is a pagan king, and although there's no explicit suggestion that Cordelia is a Christian princess, the words of the King of France who takes her up in hand in marriage after Lear rejects her, I quote, and this is on the handout, "Fairest Cordelia, thou art most rich being poor, most choice forsaken, and most loved despised," is a paraphrase of St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, quote, also on the handout, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor." Unlike the Virgin Martyrs who were rejected by their pagan fathers and who were betrothed to Christ, Cordelia is rewarded then by being accepted by the King of France, whose citation of St. Paul's words would, I think, have identified him in the mind of these local Catholic spectators with the celestial bridegroom Christ himself. Now, the point is that Shakespeare adds those words to his play. He's consciously and deliberately using the words from Corinthians, right? I think that's very significant. But he would also probably have been familiar with the lives of the Virgin Martyrs, since they did enjoy an afterlife in early 17th century England, notwithstanding being prohibited. Lots of books got into England even though they weren't allowed to be in England. They were smuggled in. Alexandra Walsham, a major historian, has pointed to a manuscript collection of holy women's lives compiled between 1610 and 1615, which included accounts of lives of British martyrs. So there were British Virgin Martyrs as well. And Shakespeare seems to have shown a special interest. I go into this in the other part of my book, not so much here, in reading Catholic literature, especially illegal pamphlets written by priests smuggled into England. It's like he was always kind of on the lookout for this stuff, this sort of samizdat literature. So it's plausible, even likely, that he was thinking of the medieval stories of the Virgin Martyrs when adapting the Lear story with Cordelia. Does that make sense so far? Now, along with St. Catherine, the most popular Virgin Martyr, this is the next image, was St. Margaret of Antioch, on the left there. According to her legend, Margaret defies her pagan father, embraces Christianity, and is martyred for her faith. The miraculous culmination of her story is her triumphant emergence from the stomach of a dragon, which symbolises the Devon. Can you see that very cute little dragon there? Next to her, well, that's the... there's a wonderful one I saw where she's actually holding the dragon by a leash. It's like a little doggy. It's a complete domestication of the same image. But this one is this rather more fearsome, fire-breathing dragon. Now, intriguingly, Lear refers to himself as a dragon. He speaks of his dragon's wrath when he threatens the dissenting Earl of Kent, who, if you remember, sides with Cordelia in warning the king against the dangers of flattery. I think this is all very interesting. Margaret's triumph over the dragon became one of the most popular devotional images of the later Middle Ages, illustrated in church wall paintings, statues and stained glass. As Eamon Duffy points out, quote, "The privileged place of Catherine and Margaret in late medieval piety is attested by the fact that their statues stood on either side of the shrine image of Our Lady at Walsingham." Walsingham was a major pilgrimage site in England devoted to the Virgin Mary. And we see this configuration in the sculpture of the head of John the Baptist here, flanked by Margaret. This is Margaret here. I don't know if you can see a dragon, I can't. But this is Catherine with her famous wheel. Can you see? Now, although the medieval Marian shrine at Walsingham had been abolished and images of the saints were prescribed during the Reformation, the memory of the Virgin and the saints lingered on among the faithful. Saints were very, very important to English Catholics, and had always been important to the English. Some of the images of saints that have survived in English churches were defaced, as can be seen in the next image, the image of St. Dorothea in Tuddenham Church in Norfolk. I don't know if you can see, but actually there are scratch marks. Can you see a scratch mark? That's not the reproduction of the image, that's the actual painting. In other words, people tried to deface the image under instructions from the government. Now, Ruth Vaniter, another scholar, has detected the outlawed medieval cult of the Virgin Mary in the final scene of The Winter's Tale by Shakespeare, where Hermione's statue, or what purports to be Hermione's statue, as it turns out to be Hermione herself, is hidden in Paulina's private chapel, just as statues of saints, rosaries and other objects of devotion were concealed from the prying eyes of the government. So it's another interesting insight. Many Catholic women, like Anne Vaux and Eleanor Brooksby, daughter of William III Baron Vaux of Horridon, maintained their own private chapels and concealed illicit priests in specially designed priest holes, which is the next image. See how skillful those priest holes were? The priests could sneak in, and they often would spend whole days when there were these ambushes or these searches by so-called pursuivants, who were government agents who were sent to track them down. According to the Jesuit priest Oswald Tesman, Eleanor may have sheltered as many as 20 or 30 priests at Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire, a manor house she rented not many miles north from Shakespeare's birthplace, Stratford-upon-Avon. So a lot of the stuff was happening in Shakespeare's home county, so to speak, in the Midlands, right, and northern England. A well-known case was the recusant Frances Burroughs, who refused to disclose the whereabouts of priests in a house. Some of these women had real courage, I'm telling you. The irate pursuivant, the spy, held his naked dagger at her breast and threatened to kill her unless she revealed where they were hidden. "If you do," she cried, "it shall be the hottest blood that thou ever sheddest in thy life." I love those strong women. I grew up with strong English women. I love them. In The Winter's Tale, the indomitable Paulina, who defies the tyranny of King Leontes, typifies this kind of courageous woman. Her defiant words to Leontes' threats resonate with the defiance of these chaste ladies, Anne Vaux and the widow Eleanor Brooksby, but also the virgin martyrs of the early church, whom they were consciously emulating. This is the next speech by Paulina. "What studied torments, tyrant, hast for me?" She's speaking to Leontes. Notice again the word tyrant. Tyrant, tyrant, tyrant. It keeps coming up. "What wheels, racks, fires, what flaying, boiling in leads or oils, what old or new a torture must I receive, whose every word deserves to taste of thy most worst?" Well, the wheel there could well be a reference to the grisly fate of St. Catherine we saw in that early image, who, according to a legend, is strapped to a wheel, equipped with sharply revolving blades to slice up her body. And being boiled alive in oil recalls the apocryphal martyrdom of Christ's favourite disciple, St. John the Evangelist, one of the most popular virgin martyrs in the late Middle Ages. And a picture of him is on the handout, but there's also the original image, which I took that image handout from, is there that you can pass around. Brother Nathan has it. You'll see at the top there a French printed primer. This is the kind of thing that was often secreted into England, and we think that Shakespeare may have had access to some of these illicit printed documents and primers, Catholic primers. Now, 4 months after the discovery of the gunpowder plot, Anne Vaux was placed in solitary confinement and interrogated in the Tower of London for her alleged complicity with the plotters and for harbouring the head of the Jesuit province, Sir Henry Garnet, who was executed at the same time that Shakespeare was writing his most bloody play, Macbeth, in 1605. And I have a whole chapter on Macbeth where I talk about the subplot there, the subtext there. Anne answered the question of her interrogators sensibly and even admitted that her suspicions of the plot had been raised while she was on pilgrimage with some of the plotters at the shrine of the Welsh virgin martyr Winifred. But when she was accused of sexual impropriety with Garnet Vox, laughed loudly 2 or 3 times and rounded on her accusers. "You come to me with this child's play and impertinence, a sign that you have nothing of importance with which to charge me." You have to have real courage to do that in an era when the government has immense power. Mistress Vox's words recall the contemptuous words uttered by Paulina to, again, the obsessive Leontes, who's convinced against all evidence that his devoted wife Hermione has been unfaithful to him. Paulina, "Thy tyranny, together working with thy jealousies, fancies too weak for boys, too green and idle for girls of 9. Oh, think what they have done, and then run mad indeed, stark mad, for all thy bygone fooleries were but spices of it." Okay? King Lear and the Catholic Martyrs. The subplot of the play, which is Edgar's betrayal by his illegitimate brother Edmund, sons of the Earl of Gloucester, might equally have resonated with the Catholic spectators in Yorkshire. Edmund's betrayal is based on a forged letter, if you remember, purportedly written by Edgar, who wishes to usurp his father's lands and title, but actually it's Edmund who wants to usurp the lands and title. The false denunciation of friends and family members became common practice during the Reformation. Sometimes denunciations involved members of the same family, as in the play. In Elizabeth's reign, a Protestant father in London denounced his son as a recusant, and the latter was flogged and seared through the ear in a public punishment. Aren't you glad you live in the 21st century? It could be a lot worse, my friends. When you're feeling depressed about the political situation, really. Frequently, as in the case of Edmund, denunciation was motivated by the desire to inherit land or acquire a neighbour's property. This was a particular problem for Catholics because many of them were members of the landed gentry. They had money, they had land, and therefore they were vulnerable to the greed of their neighbours. Following the arrest of the Jesuit priest Edmund Campion, that's the next image, and 2 other priests in 1581, this gentleman was also martyred, of course, the Privy Council instructed Francis Hastings, brother of the Earl of Huntingdon and a fervent Protestant, to search the house of his kinswoman, the Catholic landowner Elizabeth Beaumont. Campion had been betrayed by a man called George Eliot, not to be confused with the famous 19th century novelist, and the denunciation led to the priest's capture at Lyford Grange on July the 17th, 1581, when Campion, along with 2 other priests, were concealed in one of those priest's holes, right? Now, the search of Elizabeth Beaumont's house yielded no incriminating items, but this did not deter Hastings, who recommended searching other houses in the same county, including Newark Grange, the home of Eleanor Brooksby. In his letter to the Privy Council, Hastings professed his great love for his country and to Her Majesty, but as one scholar has acidly pointed out, his love for the manor house of Newark Grange, the reversion for which he petitioned in a postscript to his letter, may also have encouraged him in his civic duty. Frank Brownlow, another scholar, also invokes the real-life case of Thomas Fitzherbert, who, like Edmund in the play, turns government informer on his recusant family so that he could gain their estates. Fitzherbert became one of the henchmen of the most notorious of Elizabeth's torturers, Sir Richard Topcliffe, the Queen's personal rackmaster. Oh yes, he was responsible to her and her alone, who had come to prominence in the crushing of the Northern Uprising of 1569. For Brownlow, the activities of Topcliffe and the government he served are accurately reflected in the portrayal of an illegitimate power in King Lear, a play whose cruelty, quote, is remarkably true to the conditions of life for Elizabeth's Catholic subjects. Edmund's false denunciation of his brother may have evoked Protestant attempts to discredit and betray their recusant neighbours and family members, while Edgar suggests those, like the Vaux family, unjustly accused and punished for crimes, above all high treason, that they did not commit. Now, Shakespeare may have actually heard of the tribulations of the Vaux family through a book known as A Declaration of Egregious Popish Impostures. Great title. Egregious Popish Impostures, published in 1603 by William Harsnet, chaplain to Bishop of London Richard Bancroft. The Bishop of London had presided over an official inquiry into the strange events of 1585, when several Catholic priests claimed to have exorcised the devil from Nicholas Harwood and Sarah Williams, a maid to Lady Vaux in the London family home in Hackney. The purpose of Harsnet's book was to discredit the power of popish priests and to show that the exorcism had been a Catholic imposture. Shakespeare alludes to this incident through the speeches of the exiled Edgar, by now known as Poor Tom. "This is the foul fiend Flibbertigibbet. He begins at curfew and walks till the first cock." And that name Flibbertigibbet comes up in Harsnet's book. So Shakespeare did not make up this diabolical name, but seems to have lifted it from the account of the exorcism in the Vaux household. So this is interesting. Shakespeare's reading everything, right? And it's coming into the play. Edgar's transformation into poor Tom, naked, humiliated, and wounded, may also, I think, have made Catholics in the audience think of the late medieval icon of the Man of Sorrows, seen here on the left. The original, incidentally, is in the Art Institute in Chicago, 15th century German image, one of the most popular and widespread images of Christ crowned with thorns and lacerated by wounds. Late Elizabethan England was notorious for its vagrancy problem, and the homeless were not infrequently the target of the authorities. One of the results, by the way, of the dissolution of the monasteries, because the monasteries had basically been major centres of care for the poor and the ill, so you get rid of the monasteries, you create a big homeless problem. In his account of landing secretly in England and trying to reach London without detection, the missionary priest John Sherrod, and if you ever get the opportunity to read his autobiography, it's like reading a Cold War spy novel. It's the most extraordinary thing. The guy actually escapes from the Tower of London and survives to tell the tale. Yeah, it's amazing. Someone should make a film about it. The missionary priest John Sherrod mentions the risk of being arrested as a vagrant as he made his way through the English countryside. Edgar's disguise as poor Tom recalls the fate of such priests as Sherrod and his companion Edward Aldcorn, who were required to move incognito in order to avoid capture. The phrase "no port is free" in Edgar's monologue alludes to the closed ports of England during the later years of Elizabeth's reign, when the regime feared a Spanish invasion from the continent of Ireland, but they also feared these priests coming in. They saw them as seditious and subversive. Banished Kent, if you remember, Kent is banished by Lear, is another character who is forced to assume a disguise in order to avoid detection. He kind of goes underground. And this was the fate of many Catholics, especially priests. Kent's unjust treatment by being placed in the stocks for defending his master, Lear, recalls the real-life fate of Thomas Pound, a Jesuit lay brother and close friend and supporter of Campion. Pound was placed in the stocks and his ears nailed to a board, a fate I put to you far worse than Kent's. Pound was periodically imprisoned for recusancy, the longest period being in Wisbech Castle in Cambridgeshire, a detention centre for religious dissidents whom the state was unable or unwilling to prosecute, a legal black hole not unlike Guantanamo Bay. The Guantanamo Bay would be our modern equivalent. The theme of a just man unjustly punished also recalls the early Tudor morality play Youth, which went into 5 print editions down to 1562 and may have been familiar to Shakespeare. This play seems to have been written for a northern audience too, perhaps for the Percy family, the same family that led the Northern Uprising. The allegorical character Youth is led astray by Pride, with a capital P, and by Riot, who steals purses in order to pay his way into the tavern. Pride and Riot then fetter Charity and place him in the stocks. Charity's response quotes Christ's Sermon on the Mount. Beati qui persecutionem patientur propter justitiam. Blessed are those who have suffered persecution because of righteousness. Kent also suffers on account of his righteousness, and Catholics in the audience, I think, would have identified with him for that reason. For many Catholics watching King Lear then, the violent treatment of Kent and the subsequent blinding and interrogation of Gloucester would have recalled the interrogation of Catholics who had sheltered missionary priests like Campion. 2 of these, Lord Vaux and his brother-in-law, Sir Thomas Tresham, were implicated in Campion's mission and had allegedly shown him welcome. They'd hidden him. Whether Campion divulged their names under torture is not known, but the Catholic gentlemen were brought to London for interrogation. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was responsible for questioning Thomas Tresham. Quote, "Whether were they, or any such, or any seminary men or priests at your house, and at what time, and how often?" This form of pointed questioning is echoed in Regan and Cornwell's interrogation of Gloucester in Act 3, Scene 7. Quote, "Come, sir, what letters had you from France? Be simple answered, for we know the truth. And what confederacy have you with the traitors late-footed in the kingdom?" Traitors late-footed in the kingdom, that sounds to me like priests who had been crept into England, or as they were claimed to be. 20 years later, another of Campion's associates, Edward Aldcorn, was rounded up as an accessory to the gunpowder plot, tortured and executed on April the 6th, 1606. This bit is going to ruin your lunch, I'm afraid. Following the ritualistic half-hanging and disemboweling, the executioner struck the priest's head so ferociously with his axe that the martyr's right eyeball flew out of the socket. It was found by a Catholic improviser who kept it and placed it in a silver reliquary still preserved at Stonyhurst College in Lancashire. This violent real-life episode, I think, resonates with the blinding of Gloucester in King Lear. It's about the same time that Shakespeare was writing the play. So as Shakespeare's audience watched the horrific blinding of Gloucester, they may have thought of Old Corn, and they may have also associated the interrogator's insistent questions about Dover, wherefore to Dover, wherefore to Dover, wherefore to Dover, why are you taking the king to Dover, blah blah, with Douay, the Flemish college in Flanders, where the Catholic missionary priests, many of them, like Old Corn, had been trained and prepared for their eventual mission to England. And the scholar Helena Cooper has pointed out the probable influence of the buffeting of Christ from the medieval mystery plays in the scene of Gloucester's blinding. I think this is the next one. Oh no. Is it the next one? Yeah. In distinction to Shakespeare's earlier dramatic depictions of extreme violence, such as Titus Andronicus, King Lear follows the example of the Passion plays, the medieval Passion plays, in replacing words with moving silence. Gloucester doesn't say very much. He's silent. Moreover, in some medieval paintings of the Passion, Christ is seated just as Gloucester is strapped to a chair during his blinding. And as you can see here, this famous 15th century image by Fra Angelico in Florence sees Christ not only being tormented and buffeted and blindfolded, but he's seated, right? Penitence and mourning. The final scene of King Lear, in which the distraught Lear enters, carrying his murdered daughter Cordelia, may also, I think, have reminded Catholic members of the audience of the medieval motif of the Pietà. I think that's where we have to go. Yeah, there we are. The tableau in which the Virgin Mary mourns the dead Christ. This is on the right. This devotional image was common in medieval and counter-Reformation Europe, but it was strictly prohibited in Protestant England. So it's all the more significant there's a resonance of it in King Lear. And it comes up very strong in productions where you see the tableau-like quality. As Catherine Goodland has shown, the scene of King Lear actually inverts the traditional Pietà by placing the daughter in a father's arm rather than the son's in the mother's. And this may have been intended to camouflage the Catholic nature of the motif, but it doesn't reduce its affective impact. It's very moving to see this on stage, if you've ever seen productions of King Lear. In the medieval period, tears were traditionally deemed to be a sign of God's grace. Goodland has argued that the sight of a father weeping instead of a mother would have actually shocked Protestant sensibilities, for whom excessive weeping and mourning were considered unmanly and effeminate. I think present hang-up with all that stuff may be actually a kind of legacy of a certain Protestant sensibility. Hamlet, you may recall, is upbraided by the Protestant Claudius for mourning his father excessively, and of course the father has just returned from the very Catholic realm of purgatory. There's a whole area of that I discuss in my book too. By contrast, copious weeping was deemed appropriate to Catholic men as well as women, as witnessed by the popular tear poetry of Shakespeare's kinsman Robert Southwell, another priest who was martyred in 1595. Southwell's poem, Man to the Wound in Christ's Side, is a reworking of a popular medieval devotional poem known as the Anima Christi, in which the suppliant contemplates the suffering body of Christ on the cross and pleads to be concealed within his wounds. Southwell's poem includes the kind of imagery for which he was well known to Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And there's one possibility of a moment in Macbeth where Macbeth speaks of a baby weeping, maybe a resonance of the famous poem The Burning Babe by Southwell, which Shakespeare almost certainly knew. Okay, the conclusion. So why Shakespeare changed the ending of Geoffrey of Monmouth's medieval story in the old play King Lear is ultimately unknowable. What can be asserted with some degree of certainty is that he intended to shock his audience. Kent's words, "Is this the promised end?" would have echoed the reaction of many of people in the original audience. They weren't expecting this ending. They were expecting the ending provided by the old play and by Geoffrey, and Shakespeare changed it. It's impossible to say what Shakespeare was thinking when he wrote his tragic ending. Was he, as some scholars have argued, an atheist who lays bare the godless world of the play? Was he an existentialist avant la lettre who gives us no hope? Perhaps more important than trying to establish the playwright's own beliefs is to recognise that different audiences of the play would have reacted in different ways. And I've suggested that the beleaguered Catholics of Nidderdale, and Catholics elsewhere, not just there, may have responded rather differently from a predominantly Protestant audience in London, or from a modern audience for that matter. For Catholics, the play's themes of sin, suffering, and penitence were crucial to their own experience as internal religious exiles in Protestant England. To be sure, in King Lear, the medieval dramatic arc from pride to penitence, from suffering to salvation, is no longer as clear-cut or as straightforward as in the medieval romances, which Shakespeare clearly drew upon in writing this and several other plays. I argue in my book that Richard II is heavily informed by Shakespeare's reading of medieval romances. Indeed, the Shakespeare scholar James Wade sees a world of difference between the late medieval emphasis on penitence and grace and Shakespeare's foreclosing of this possibility in the bleak world of the play. Quote, "If Guy of Warwick, who's a hero of the medieval romance genre, can die on stage as a romance hero, it is because his reward in bliss is assured. But it's only when Lear dies on stage with Cordelia in his arms that the audience realizes that the whole of his penitential process counted for nothing. There is no one checking the amends-making ledger balance, and there is no grace. Lear's promised end is indeed a wheel of fire," unquote. This famous image that's used in the play Wheel of Fire. But perhaps the gulf between the older medieval worldview and that of Shakespeare's audience, Catholic audience, was not as great as Professor Wade suggests. The good people of Nidderdale may not have responded to the grim ending in quite the same way that we tend to today. As I've suggested, the violent unravelling of Lear's kingdom may have reminded them of their own situation of the rebellious northern England in 1569, especially the gruesome aftermath and the mass execution of rebels. In so doing, the play's ending confirmed for them not a world from which God had absconded, not a deus absconditus, but of an unforgiving and vengeful Protestant regime, not metaphysical despair, but political reality. Instead of being paraded as penitents with nooses round their necks, later to be pardoned by a merciful monarch, as previous rebellions against the crown had ended, including those against Henry VIII and Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's Catholic older sister, the captured rebels of the Northern Uprising were hanged in hasty proceedings conducted under martial law. In witnessing Cordelia's body on stage with a noose around her neck and her broken-hearted father holding her in his arms, the Catholics of Nidderdale might have been mindful of the similar fate of their neighbours and co-religionists in the ruthless world of Tudor absolutism, not the godless landscape of a modern existentialist play, but the oppressive world of Shakespeare's England. Thank you.